June 6, 1944, 6:32 a.m. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The morphine syringe was frozen solid in my hand. I was crouched behind a steel beach. Obstacle called a hedgehog. 3 pieces of angle iron welded together like a giant jack, while machine gun fire from the bluffs above cut down men faster than I could count. The soldier in front of me had taken shrapnel to both legs, femoral artery compromised. He was bleeding out in the surf, screaming for his mother, and the morphine that should have eased his pain was a useless frozen tube, because nobody had told us the English Channel in June was cold enough to freeze blood plasma. I was 29 years old, a pharmacist from Philadelphia, had never seen combat, never treated a gunshot wound, never watched a man die. But I was wearing a white armband with a red cross, which meant I was supposed to save people. Before I tell you how many men died because of frozen morphine and how we fixed it using something you probably have in your kitchen, right? Now smash that subscribe button. The stories on this channel will change everything you think you know about World War II. Trust me, you need to hear what's coming next. Now let me take you back. Because the miracle drug that won D-Day, the pharmaceutical breakthrough that saved thousands of lives on those beaches, almost didn't make it to Normandy at all. And when it did arrive, nobody knew how to use it properly. Part 1, the wonder drug, nobody understood. September 1928. St. Mary's Hospital, London. Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to find his laboratory contaminated. Petri dishes full of Staphylococcus bacteria had been invaded by mold, probably blown in through an open window. Any other scientist would have thrown them away and started over. Fleming looked closer. Around each mold colony, the bacteria had died. Something in that mold was killing one of humanity's most dangerous pathogens. Fleming isolated the mold, Penicillium notatum, and discovered it produced a substance he called penicillin. But he couldn't purify it, couldn't produce it in useful quantities. Published his findings in 1929, then moved on to other research. For 12 years, penicillin existed only as a laboratory curiosity that nobody quite knew how to weaponize against disease. Then came World War II. In 1939, Oxford University researchers Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, a refugee from Nazi Germany, read Fleming's papers and realized penicillin's potential. Bacteria had killed more soldiers in World War I than bullets. Infected wounds, gangrene, sepsis, these killed men by the thousands. A drug that could stop bacterial infections would revolutionize battlefield medicine. They began the painful process of purification, growing the mold in every container they could find, bedpans, milk bottles, ceramic vessels, extracting tiny amounts of penicillin through laborious chemical processes. By 1941, they had enough to treat one patient, a British policeman dying from a bacterial infection. He improved dramatically within days. Then the penicillin ran out and he died. But Florey had proven the concept. Penicillin worked. It could cure bacterial infections that nothing else could touch. The problem was production. Britain, under siege and bombing, couldn't dedicate resources to mass-producing an experimental drug. So Florey took his research to America, June 1941. Peoria, Illinois. The Northern Regional Research Laboratory. Florey met with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Fermentation Research Division. If anyone could figure out mass production, it would be the American industrial machine that had turned pharmaceuticals into a science of scale. The challenges were immense. The original Penicillium notatum mold produced tiny amounts of penicillin, maybe 2 units per milliliter. To treat a single wounded soldier required millions of units. Growing the mold required specialized equipment, temperature control and nutrients that were expensive and difficult to source. Purification required complex chemical processes that were labor-intensive and inefficient. Stability was uncertain. Nobody knew how long purified penicillin remained effective, or how to store it properly. But America had something Britain didn't: industrial capacity, abundant resources, and researchers who believed every problem had a solution if you threw enough money and talent at it. Dr. Andrew Moyer at the Northern Regional Lab made the first breakthrough. Instead of growing penicillin in expensive laboratory media, he tried corn steep liquor, a cheap byproduct of the corn processing industry that Peoria had in abundance. The yield increased tenfold. Lab technician Mary Hunt made the second breakthrough. Vlori had asked everyone in Peoria to bring moldy items from home for testing. Maybe a different mold strain would produce more penicillin. Hunt brought a cantaloupe from a local market. It was covered in golden mold. That mold, Penicillium chrysogenum, produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original strain. With better mold and better nutrients, production suddenly became feasible. But America needed more. Needed industrial-scale fermentation that had never been attempted for any pharmaceutical. Enter the pharmaceutical companies: Pfizer, Merck, Squibb. Companies that had manufactured aspirin and vitamins now retooled to produce this strange new antibiotic. They built fermentation tanks that held thousands of gallons, developed deep tank fermentation methods that grew mold faster and denser, created purification systems that processed penicillin by the kilogram instead of by the gram. By 1943, America was producing penicillin in quantities that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. But there was one critical problem nobody had anticipated: how to deliver it to soldiers in combat. Part 2, the delivery problem. That's where I came in. I'd been drafted in 1942. Pharmacy degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Spent 18 months at various Army medical facilities learning military medicine. The Army looked at my civilian credentials and said, "You understand drugs. Make yourself useful." In March 1944, I was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division medical staff. We were preparing for something big. Nobody would say what, but the training intensity suggested a major amphibious assault. And we were stockpiling medical supplies like we expected massive casualties, including penicillin. The drug arrived in small glass vials, each containing 100,000 units of penicillin sodium in powdered form. You mixed it with sterile water, creating a solution that could be injected intramuscularly. One vial could fight infection in a moderately wounded soldier. Severe cases might need 6 vials daily for a week. We'd been told penicillin was miraculous. Wounded soldiers in North Africa and Italy, who should have died from infected wounds, were surviving thanks to penicillin. Gangrene, the nightmare of battlefield medicine, the condition that killed more. Civil War soldiers than bullets could be prevented with penicillin treatment within the first 24 hours of injury. But nobody had tested it in the conditions we'd face at Normandy. Late May 1944, we conducted amphibious landing rehearsals at Slapton Sands in southern England. The exercise was supposed to simulate D-Day conditions, and it revealed catastrophic problems with our medical protocols. The mock casualties, soldiers playing wounded, were treated with training supplies. But when medics opened their medical kits after being in the water, they found disaster. Morphine syrettes frozen solid or rendered ineffective by salt water. Sulfur powder contaminated by sand and water. Bandages soaked through and useless. Penicillin vials shattered by rough handling during the beach assault. Captain Morrison, our chief medical officer, assembled all medical personnel for an emergency briefing. "Gentlemen, we have a problem. The supplies we've been issued aren't designed for amphibious assault. The morphine freezes in cold water. The penicillin vials break. The bandages get waterlogged, and we're about to conduct the largest amphibious invasion in history. He looked around the room at 60 medics and doctors, all of us trying to process this information. We have 2 weeks to figure out solutions. I'm open to suggestions. The room was silent. These were problems nobody had anticipated. Medical supplies were designed for field hospitals, not for combat medics wading through surf under machine gun fire. I raised my hand. Sir, regarding the morphine, what if we pre-warmed the syrettes using body heat? Soldiers could keep them in interior pockets against their skin. Body temperature should keep them liquid. Good, do it. What about the penicillin? Sir, the vials are too fragile for combat conditions. But I had an idea. What if we pre-mixed the penicillin solutions before the landing? Put them in small metal containers that can survive rough handling. Soldiers could carry them in their packs, and medics could administer them immediately without having to mix solutions under fire. Morrison considered this. How long does mixed penicillin solution remain effective? Unknown, sir. The pharmaceutical literature suggests 24 hours, but nobody's tested it under field conditions. Then test it. You have 1 week to develop a delivery system that works. Because if we can't deliver penicillin effectively on those beaches, hundreds, maybe thousands of men will die from infections that we have the medicine to prevent. That was my assignment. Figure out how to deliver a fragile pharmaceutical drug under the worst possible conditions. Cold water, rough handling, contamination from sand and salt water, and administration by medics who'd be under enemy fire. I spent the next week in an improvised laboratory, testing everything I could think of. Metal containers, too heavy, took up too much space. Rubber bladders, punctured too easily. Waxed cardboard, dissolved in salt water. Glass ampoules, too fragile. Then I had an idea. What if we used something already proven in extreme conditions? I requisitioned metal tubes used for toothpaste, filled them with pre-mixed penicillin solution, sealed them, subjected them to every abuse I could imagine, dropped them, stepped on them, soaked them in cold salt water, baked them in the sun. The tubes survived. The penicillin remained potent. I showed Morrison my prototype. Sir, toothpaste tubes, commercially available, already manufactured by the millions, designed to survive rough handling. We fill them with penicillin solution, seal them hermetically, and issue them to medics. When a medic needs to administer penicillin, he just punctures the tube with a syringe needle, draws the solution, and injects the patient. Morrison stared at the tube. Toothpaste tubes? Yes, sir. Simple, durable, effective. How much penicillin per tube? 200,000 units. Enough for 2 standard doses. Each medic can carry 10 tubes, enough to treat 5 severely wounded soldiers or 20 with moderate infections. He tested the tube himself, dropped it, stepped on it, submerged it in a bucket of cold salt water, retrieved it, punctured it with a needle, drew solution. The penicillin was intact. Get this to procurement immediately. I want 50,000 tubes manufactured before we ship out. That's when I learned about American industrial capacity firsthand. I submitted my specifications on May 27th. By June 4th, 8 days later, the first shipment of penicillin-filled toothpaste tubes arrived at our staging area. 50,000 units, each one potentially capable of saving a life, but we still had the morphine problem. Part 3. The morphine solution. Morphine was critical for battlefield medicine. A wounded soldier in shock needed immediate pain relief, or the shock itself could kill him. But the standard morphine delivery system, a syrette that looked like a small toothpaste tube with an attached needle, had a fatal flaw. In water temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the morphine solution crystallized, became a useless frozen gel that couldn't be injected. The English Channel in June averaged 55 degrees, marginal. But soldiers would be in that water for minutes or hours, and their body temperature would drop. The morphine in their first aid kits would freeze. Sergeant Williams, one of our medical NCOs, suggested the solution during a late-night planning session. "Sir, what if we add alcohol to the morphine solution?" "Alcohol lowers the freezing point. That's why car radiators use anti-freeze. Water mixed with ethylene glycol stays liquid at lower temperatures." I ran the calculations. Medical-grade ethanol mixed with the morphine solution at 20% concentration would lower the freezing point to approximately 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Well below anything we'd encounter in the channel. Morrison looked skeptical. "Does alcohol affect morphine's effectiveness?" "Unknown, sir, but I can test it. I spent 2 days testing morphine ethanol solutions on laboratory animals, rabbits that the Army Medical Corps used for pharmaceutical research. The alcohol didn't reduce morphine's analgesic effect. If anything, it seemed to increase absorption slightly." Morrison approved it. "We requisitioned 100,000 morphine syrettes with alcohol-enhanced solution. They arrived June 5th, the day before we shipped out. Nobody in the medical community had ever done this. We were improvising battlefield pharmaceutical delivery on the fly, with no time for proper clinical trials, betting soldiers' lives that our modifications would work. But we didn't have a choice. The invasion was happening with or without proper medical supplies. Better to try something that might work than stick with systems we knew would fail." Part 4. D-Day, which brings us back to June 6, 1944, 6:32 a.m., Omaha Beach. The landing craft's ramp dropped, and I stepped into hell. Machine gun fire from the bluffs above sounded like fabric tearing. Men were falling before they reached the beach. The soldier next to me took a round through the neck, dropped into the surf, and didn't come back up. Blood turned the water pink for 20 feet in every direction. I carried a medical bag that weighed 40 pounds. Bandages, sulfur powder, surgical tools, and most importantly, 20 tubes of penicillin and 50 morphine syrettes. Everything I needed to keep men alive long enough to reach the field hospitals, if I could reach them. If I didn't get killed in the next 30 seconds, the hedgehog obstacle provided minimal cover. Behind it, a soldier with leg wounds was screaming. I could see the arterial bleeding, bright red, pulsing. He had maybe 3 minutes before he bled out. I pulled a tourniquet from my bag, applied it above the wound, tightened until the bleeding slowed. Then I grabbed a morphine syrette. My hands were shaking. From fear, from cold, from the adrenaline. The syrette should have been frozen solid. We'd been in 55-degree water for 20 minutes. But when I squeezed it, liquid morphine flowed. The alcohol modification had worked. I injected the soldier half a syrette, the standard combat dose. Within 30 seconds, his screaming subsided. The morphine was doing its job, keeping him from going into shock while I worked on his wounds. Then I opened my medical bag and pulled out one of the toothpaste tubes. Penicillin solution, 200,000 units. I punctured it with a syringe needle, drew the solution, and injected it into the soldier's thigh. "What's that?" He gasped through morphine-dulled pain. "Penicillin. Keeps infections from killing you after the wound does. You're going to be fine, soldier. Just stay still." I bandaged his legs, marked his forehead with an M in grease pencil to show he'd received morphine, and moved to the next casualty. For the next 4 hours, I worked my way across Omaha Beach, treating wounds, administering penicillin, keeping men alive long enough for evacuation. The toothpaste tubes worked perfectly, durable enough to survive the conditions, easy enough to use under fire, and the alcohol-enhanced morphine saved dozens of lives that morning. Soldiers who should have frozen to death from shock in the cold water survived because we'd modified the standard pharmaceutical delivery system. By noon, I'd used all 20 penicillin tubes and 40 morphine syrettes. I'd treated approximately 30 soldiers with varying injuries. How many survived? I didn't know. Couldn't know. I just kept working, moving from casualty to casualty, doing what I'd been trained to do. At 2 p.m., a naval corpsman found me in a crater, treating a soldier with abdominal wounds. "Sir, you need to fall back to the aid station. You're a non-combatant. Shouldn't be this far forward. There are wounded here who need immediate treatment. They can't wait for evacuation. Sir, with respect, you're no good to anyone dead. Please fall back." He was right. I'd been on the beach for 7.5 hours, had treated 36 men, was exhausted, dehydrated, and operating on pure adrenaline. Time to let the evacuation system do its job. I made my way back to the aid station, a depression behind a seawall where doctors had set up a makeshift field hospital. The scene was chaos. Dozens of wounded soldiers waiting for treatment. Blood everywhere. Medics moving between patients, triaging, treating, evacuating. Captain Morrison found me. "Fox, you're alive. Good. We need everyone. Get some water, reload your supplies, and get back out there. We've got hundreds of wounded and not enough medics." I refilled my medical bag. More penicillin tubes, more morphine syrettes, more bandages and sulfur powder. Then back to the beach. The fighting continued until nightfall. By then, we'd established a secure beachhead, but the cost had been horrific. Approximately 2,400 American casualties on Omaha Beach alone. Dead, wounded, missing. I'd personally treated 47 men that day, administered penicillin to 32, given morphine to 44, stopped arterial bleeding on 11, performed emergency tracheotomies on 2 soldiers whose throats had been damaged by shrapnel. How many survived? The evacuation records would later show that of the 47 men I'd treated, 39 made it off the beach alive. Several died later from their wounds, but 32 survived to go home. 32 lives saved by modified pharmaceutical delivery systems that we'd invented 2 weeks earlier. Part 5. The infection. War, but D-Day was just the beginning. The real test came in the days and weeks after, when infection threatened to kill men who'd survived their wounds. June 10, 1944. Field hospital near Sainte-Mère-Église. I'd been transferred from frontline medical work to the field hospital, where my pharmaceutical expertise was more valuable. The hospital was processing hundreds of wounded daily, soldiers evacuated from the beaches with gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, fractures, and infections. Got the infections? Battlefield wounds are inherently contaminated. Dirt, fabric from uniforms, debris from explosions, all carried deep into tissue by bullets and shrapnel. In World War I, infection killed 8% of all wounded soldiers. Gangrene, sepsis, necrotizing fasciitis, bacterial infections that turned survivable wounds into death sentences. Penicillin was supposed to change that, and it did. But we were learning its limitations in real time. Private Anderson came in on June 11th, leg wound from June 6th, had been treated with penicillin on the beach. But now, 5 days later, the wound was infected. Red, swollen, hot to touch, pus draining from the entry site. Classic signs of bacterial infection. Hasn't the penicillin worked? The surgeon asked me. I examined Anderson's medical tag. He received 200,000 units on D-Day. That's sufficient for initial treatment, but wound contamination was severe. He needs ongoing therapy. How much? Current protocols suggest 100,000 units every 3 hours until the infection clears. The surgeon stared at me. Every 3 hours? That's 800,000 units daily. For how long? 5 to 7 days minimum. Fox, we have hundreds of patients. We don't have that much penicillin. He was right. Despite American industrial capacity, despite Pfizer and Merck working overtime, penicillin was still relatively scarce in June. 1944, field. Hospitals received allocations measured in millions of units. Sounds like a lot until you realize that severe infections required millions of units per patient. We faced impossible triage decisions. Who gets penicillin and who doesn't? who lives and who dies based on pharmaceutical availability. I developed a protocol. Priority 1. Life-threatening infections. Deep tissue wounds, suspected sepsis, major trauma. 800,000 units daily. Priority 2. Serious but not immediately life-threatening. Moderate wound infections. 400,000 units daily. Priority 3. Minor infections that might resolve with sulfur drugs alone. Penicillin only if sulfur fails. It was brutal mathematics. Some men who would have survived with adequate penicillin died because we had to ration a drug that America was producing millions of units of daily. The bottleneck wasn't production, it was distribution. Getting penicillin from Pfizer's factories in Brooklyn to field hospitals in Normandy involved supply chains that were still developing. By July, the supply situation improved. Penicillin shipments increased. We could treat more patients more aggressively. The death rate from infected wounds dropped from 8% in World War I to less than 1% in the Normandy campaign. That difference, 7% of thousands of casualties, represented thousands of lives saved by a drug that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. Part 6. The German perspective. What we didn't know then was that Germany was losing the pharmaceutical war even more badly than the shooting war. Oberarzt, Dr. Captain Friedrich Weber, captured in August 1944, provided intelligence that shocked Allied medical officers. "You have penicillin," he said during interrogation. "We have nothing comparable. Our soldiers die from infected wounds you treat routinely. Your wounded return to combat. Ours die or require amputation." German military medicine in 1944 still relied on sulfur drugs, effective against some bacteria but useless against many others. They knew about penicillin, had captured samples from British and American forces, but couldn't mass-produce it. Germany's chemical industry, the same industry that had pioneered synthetic dyes and pharmaceuticals before the war, couldn't crack penicillin production. The fermentation processes were too complex. The mold strains were unavailable. The industrial capacity was diverted to explosives and synthetic fuels. By 1944, a German soldier with a serious wound infection had maybe a 40% chance of survival. An American soldier with the same wound had a 90% chance. That's a strategic advantage, more significant than most weapons. An army that can return wounded soldiers to combat maintains its strength. An army that loses wounded soldiers to infection hemorrhages manpower. Weber told us something else. Your medics carry penicillin to the front lines. Administer it immediately after injury. Our medics carry bandages. By the time our wounded reach field hospitals, infection is already advanced. Many die before they can be treated. Even with the limited medicines we have, the toothpaste tube delivery system, my improvised solution created in a week, had given Allied forces a pharmaceutical advantage Germany couldn't match. Immediate penicillin administration, right on the battlefield, preventing infections before they could establish. Simple, obvious in retrospect, but revolutionary in practice. Part 7. The numbers, the statistics tell a story of pharmaceutical warfare. Penicillin production, 1943, 21 billion units produced, US, 1944, 1.6 trillion units produced, US, 1945, 6.8 trillion units produced. US military allocation, June 1944, 85% of all penicillin went to military use. Each soldier wounded in Normandy received average 2.4 million units. Total penicillin used in European theater 1944-45, over 2 trillion units. Survival rates WW2, 8% of wounded died from infection. WW2 with sulfur. Drugs, 4% infection mortality. WW2 with penicillin, 0.8% infection mortality. German comparison, penicillin. Production, effectively 0. Infection mortality, 4 to 5%. Wounded returned to duty, 40% versus 70%. Allied, the pharmaceutical advantage was decisive. Not flashy like tanks or bombers, not dramatic like infantry charges, but measurable in thousands of lives saved, soldiers returned to duty, and combat effectiveness maintained. Part 8. After the war, he stayed with the Medical Corps through the end of the war. Crossed into Germany in 1945, saw the final collapse of Nazi resistance. Treated German prisoners with the same penicillin that had saved Allied soldiers. One German doctor, working at a field hospital for prisoners, watched me administer penicillin to a Wehrmacht soldier with a severe wound infection. "How much of this do you have?" he asked in accented English. "Enough," I said. "More than enough. We produce millions of units daily. Millions." He shook his head. "We knew about penicillin, read Fleming's papers, understood the potential, but we couldn't produce it. Our industry was focused on weapons, and now our soldiers die from infections while yours recover. That's what defeated us. Not superior tactics, superior logistics and superior medical care." I came home in October 1945, returned to Philadelphia, reopened my pharmacy on Market Street. The same store where I'd filled prescriptions for antibiotics that didn't exist before the war. But now penicillin was available commercially. By 1946, any pharmacy in America could obtain it. The miracle drug that had required massive government intervention to produce during wartime became a routine pharmaceutical, priced at $20 per course of treatment. $20. To cure infections that had killed millions throughout human history. To prevent gangrene, sepsis, pneumonia, diseases that had been death sentences before 1943. I filled thousands of penicillin prescriptions in my post-war pharmacy. Each one reminded me of D-Day, of freezing water and machine gun fire and soldiers bleeding in the surf, of toothpaste tubes filled with life-saving medicine. In 1952, I was invited to speak at the American Pharmaceutical Association conference. They wanted me to discuss battlefield pharmaceutical delivery, the improvised systems we'd developed for D-Day. I showed them the toothpaste tube, explained how we'd modified morphine with alcohol, described the triage protocols for penicillin rationing. The lesson, I told them, isn't about specific solutions. It's about adaptability. We had a perfect pharmaceutical product, penicillin, that was useless because we couldn't deliver it properly. The science was sound. The production was adequate. But the delivery system was wrong for combat conditions, so we fixed it. Not through brilliant innovation, but through practical problem solving. Toothpaste tubes, alcohol antifreeze, simple solutions to complex problems. That's what saved lives on D-Day. Not the miracle drug itself, but the ability to get that drug to soldiers who needed it, in conditions nobody had planned for. The audience, hundreds of pharmacists and pharmaceutical executives, gave me a standing ovation. But I felt like a fraud. I hadn't invented anything. I'd just adapted existing technologies to new problems. That's what pharmacists do. Bridge the gap between pharmaceutical science and practical medicine. Part 9. The reunion in 1994. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day, I returned to Normandy. I was 79 years old, walking with a cane, but I wanted to see Omaha Beach one more time. The beach was pristine. No bodies, no blood, no machine gun fire. Just sand and surf and tourists taking photographs at monuments to the fallen. I walked to where I thought the hedgehog obstacle had been, the one I'd sheltered behind while treating that first. Soldier with leg wounds. Nothing remained. The beach had been cleared decades ago, but I remembered the cold water and the screaming and the morphine syringe that worked because we'd added alcohol. Remembered the toothpaste tube of penicillin that prevented infection from killing a soldier who'd survived German bullets. A French reporter approached me. She was doing a story on D-Day veterans, wanted to interview survivors. What did you do during the invasion? She asked. I was a medic. Treated wounded on the beach. Did you save many lives? I thought about that. About the 47 soldiers I'd treated, the 32 who survived the beach, the thousands who'd received penicillin in field hospitals after D-Day, the millions who'd benefited from battlefield pharmaceutical innovations throughout the war. I don't know, I said honestly. I did what I was trained to do, used the tools available. Some men lived, some didn't. The penicillin helped. The modified delivery systems helped. But medicine isn't magic. It's just doing the best you can with what you have. But penicillin was magic. Wasn't it a miracle drug? No, it was science. Science produced by American industrial capacity, delivered by medics who adapted it to battlefield conditions, administered to soldiers who'd been trained to reach medical help quickly. The miracle wasn't the drug. The miracle was the system that got the drug from a laboratory in Peoria to a beach in Normandy in time to save lives. She published that quote in her article. It became one of those things people remember from D-Day anniversary coverage. The miracle wasn't the drug. The miracle was the system. I stand by that. Penicillin was discovered by accident, produced through industrial effort, and delivered through practical improvisation. Each step was necessary. Remove any one element and thousands more would have died. Part 10. The legacy. I died in 2001 at age 86. Complications from pneumonia. Ironically, a disease that would have killed me in 1940, but was easily treatable with antibiotics in 2001. My children found my D-Day medical kit in the attic. I'd kept it as a memento. The bag I'd carried across Omaha Beach. Inside were 2 unused toothpaste tubes of penicillin, still sealed after 57 years. My daughter asked what they were. I explained the whole story, the production challenges, the delivery problems, the improvised solutions. So you invented a new way to deliver medicine, and it saved lives on D-Day. I adapted existing packaging for a new purpose. Thousands of people contributed to making penicillin work on D-Day. I was just one small part, but your part mattered. Yes, it mattered. Every part mattered. That's the lesson. Winning wars doesn't require genius. It requires competent people doing their jobs well, adapting when necessary, and supporting each other. The scientists who discovered penicillin, the industrialists who produced it, the medics who delivered it, the soldiers who got wounded men to medical care quickly, every link in that chain was essential. At my funeral, my son read from my D-Day journal. The entry for June 6, 1944, treated 47 wounded today. Lost 8 on the beach. Others may not survive their wounds. The penicillin tubes worked perfectly, durable, easy to use under fire. The alcohol-modified morphine prevented shock in dozens of men who would have died otherwise. Simple modifications, enormous impact. I keep thinking about the chain of events that led to today. Fleming's accidental discovery, Florey's persistence, American industrial production, my improvised delivery system, every step necessary. Remove anyone and men die. That's what I'll remember about today. Not the heroics or the horror, but the understanding that winning requires systems, not just courage. Requires logistics, not just tactics. Requires thousands of people doing their jobs correctly, from scientists in laboratories to medics on beaches. The miracle of D-Day wasn't that we won. The miracle was that we had the industrial capacity, medical knowledge, and adaptive capability to minimize casualties while achieving victory. That's America's real strength, not individual brilliance. Systemic excellence. The toothpaste tubes of penicillin are now in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Part of an exhibit on battlefield medicine. Next to them is a placard. These modified toothpaste tubes, filled with penicillin solution, represent the kind of practical innovation that characterized American military medicine in World War II. By adapting commercial packaging for pharmaceutical delivery under combat conditions, medics could administer life-saving antibiotics immediately after injury. preventing infections that had killed millions in previous wars. That's my legacy. Not scientific brilliance, not heroic medicine, just practical problem solving that happened to save lives, and maybe that's enough. Maybe history isn't shaped by singular geniuses, but by thousands of competent people making small improvements that accumulate into victory. The pharmacist who saved D-Day wasn't really one person. It was Fleming and Florey, and the Peoria researchers and Pfizer's factory workers, and the medics on the beach. It was a system working together. I just happened to be the guy with the toothpaste tube idea, but that idea, combined with everyone else's contributions, kept thousands of soldiers alive. And that matters. That will always matter. Even if nobody remembers my name, they'll remember that penicillin saved D-Day. That's enough for me.